Hello, everyone. Right, bear with me as I get the hang of public speaking. I'm quite rusty. So, my name is Alexei Martinov, and my friends just call me Oli. So, I've been a developer for over 10 years, and I've been a mobile developer, specifically Android, for the first half, and then I've been a full stack developer since 2018. So, kind of a 50-50 split there. And I would honestly define a software engineer or a developer as someone who's able to solve complex problems given various different constraints. And oh boy, there's a lot of different challenges that are facing full stack developers. Yeah, and this is just a small list I wrote down here, right? It could be state management for the front end, CI/CD, if you're in charge of that, right? All sorts of authentication, access management, all best security practices, payment processing, the list goes on and on and on. And I love things that make our jobs easier, right? Because reinventing the wheel can be a good learning experience, but it's not always fun if you have tight deadlines to meet. So I'm really passionate about tools that help us solve important problems for our end users. So a great tool that I'm really here to teach tonight is AWS Amplify. And if I had to define it, it's tricky to define because it's such a large kind of collection of tools altogether. But if I had to define AWS Amplify, it's a framework that allows you to build and deploy full stack applications fast. So AWS Amplify has a large set of services that it offers, or it helps developers solve a lot of problems. So authentication, data storage, analytics, continuous deployment, file storage, and all of this is done by helping you deploy and build using AWS infrastructure. So let's see. Yeah, and during this talk, I'll be going through a sample building process of a simple to-do list web app. Now, this app has authentication. It's got data storage. It's got REST. So specifically here, it's got the GraphQL API. We set up continuous deployment and integration. We have UI components from Figma designs and file storage. Now, can anyone here guess or kind of estimate how long it would take to build this kind of a to-do list web app just by using your favorite stack? Any?
Hours.
Sorry?
Few hours.
Few hours. All right, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good estimate.
Maybe a weekend.
All right, so a couple days on the weekend, right? Okay, so let's continue. So, and at the end, we'll kind of we'll gauge how close your guesses were to this, to how long this might take. So first, we'll start with a simple project setup. Here, we'll be using Next.js, and we'll create a starter Next.js application by running the npx script. I won't be doing this on my computer because the installations and deployment will take a little bit of time, so I'll just be walking through the process. So anyways, first we install the Next.js TypeScript project. Next, we will add Amplify by running amplify init command. Here, I already have Amplify configured because you have to prior link it to your AWS account keys. But to add it to a project, you just run amplify init. Next, we will start by adding CI/CD pipeline to our project. And this is just one command, amplify add hosting, which will prompt us to, I'll be switching tabs here. It will redirect us to the Amplify console, where we will connect it to our GitHub repository, where with every commit, it will kick off a build of both the backend and the front end, right? That's a really quick config here. And that's how we add the continuous deployment to our project. So next up. Next, to add an API configuration. So we will be working with GraphQL for this to-do app. And to add an API, this is an example using the CLI again. We'll be running Amplify add API. And here, it's really straightforward questions that the command line will prompt you. And here we chose GraphQL and some conflict detection for our subscription, GraphQL subscriptions for resolving concurrency issues, but don't worry about that for now. And then finally, we'll be using a template schema for this project, which is also a to-do app. How convenient. So in AWS Amplify, the source of truth is the GraphQL schema. So to deploy, we just either run Amplify push, which will trigger a backend build, or we can do a git push, and it would trigger a continuous deployment and integration flow that we configured in the previous slides. So going back to the GraphQL schema being the source of truth, let's jump into our project really quick here. So if you, so this schema was generated during our CLI command there. And here we have a simple ID, name, and the description. But then I also added completed Boolean and an image field here. So this is a basic model structure for our to-do item for the app. And we'll only have this one data model or this single item in our database. Next up, you'll notice we have an authentication tag here. So what does that do? So now to add authentication, we simply will, for this example, I'll show you how to use the Amplify Studio to add authentication, but we could also do it with command line. So Amplify Studio, once we deploy the project, we can go to the Amplify Studio, and this is a content management dashboard and admin dashboard for our application. And you get this out of the box. So this is extremely convenient, and you don't have to build this from scratch. This gives you things like your deployment activity, various so content items in the database, right? We can search our models, we can search the items in the database. We can do user management, we can help people re-authenticate, or if they forgot their emails, we can help them reset that. So all sorts of user management activities. But for authentication, here I already configured this previously, but it's a really simple UI for configuring the whole authentication for our app. We're going to be using email as the main kind of source of identity for this app. We will be using, we're also setting up a password protection strength here. And if you want to, you could also add other social media logins, through Google login or other options. But I would have to reset this specific setup to do that. So now that we've set this up, we would hit deploy, and after a few minutes, we would have the whole AWS Cognito infrastructure configured behind the scenes that we can start leveraging in our project. And that's what we saw in the so that's what we saw with the simple authentication kind of rule here. Now, if we want to get more of a visual understanding of what the structure of our models, we can actually see that as well in the Amplify Studio here. So this is the same model definition as we saw in the GraphQL, but I have a nice visual interface. But then also, I have a nice visual way to configure our authorization rules. For this app, each user has their own set of to-do items, and we don't need publicly accessible or readable data models. But if you do need that, you could configure different authorization rules for those use cases. So for anything publicly accessible, you can use an API key to get those data, to get that data from the backend. Yeah, that's how easy it is to do authentication. So anytime you update anything from the Amplify Studio, you have to remember to pull that configuration back into your project. So you do that by Amplify pull, and that would update all the resources defined in the project. All right, next up. All right, adding the UI. So setting up the UI framework and adding the authentication like login flows, the registration flows, password reset flows is extremely easy. Amplify has a UI library for adding UI components, cloud-connected UI components for things like authentication, file uploads, and other functionality. So for our example, it's 4 steps. We install the dependencies into our project, such as the Amplify JavaScript library and the React UI library. If you're using React, they also have a library for adding authentication to your React application, and they support other frameworks like React Native. Next up, here we'll have to import styles, and then finally configure the kind of Amplify singleton here, and then wrap our entry point to the app in a theme provider. And then we can use the authenticator component. So it's 4 steps to get that functionality. So let's jump into our project. So anyone here familiar with Next.js? Awesome, cool. Yeah, it's a really cool framework for helping you use React in ways that you wish you could use React, right? Like the server-side rendering and just simplifying your backend development as well. So here, our entry point is the app TypeScript file. And as we saw, normally we would just have a component here. But with our configuration, we have a theme provider for our React UI library, and then a configuration for Amplify JavaScript library here, and some dependencies up here. So the configuration is automatically generated based on our deployments. So here you can see the generated configuration file. This will have your GraphQL endpoints, the region, API key if we have it for configured, and then various Cognito password rules that we've configured in the authentication UI. S3 bucket, so all this configuration is generated for us. So, and once we have configured this entry point, simply to use authentication, we would wrap our protected routes or our protected pages with an authenticator component. Yeah, and that's how we would get this nice UI. Whoa, this nice UI. And yeah, that's the login screen, and obviously you can customize it, you can add headers and all sorts of layout. But in just a few minutes, we got a full authentication setup here. So, and creating account as well, right? Really nice. All right. Okay, so with this next slide is as a software developer, there's so many times that you have to repeat the same work that the designer already has done in Figma or other design tool. And the one big important rule in software engineering is do not repeat yourself. So why are two people doing the same work twice? With Amplify, last year they've added a way to generate your React components based on Figma designs. And for our sample app, I'll be using a Figma template that you can see here. I have a nav bar, a couple nav bars. I have the simple item card. I have a page component that's mostly a wrapper for a page and an empty list placeholder. So we'll be using these components in our app. To sync up with Figma, it's really easy. We just go to our Amplify Studio. We'll switch to the UI Library tab, and then we'll click on the sync with Figma, and there we paste the link to our Figma file. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, you'll see all the elements that you saw in our Figma file imported, and they're interactable. And we can also pull them into our project. But before we do that, let's configure some data binding. So data binding is just connecting various fields in your UI to the data model fields. And when, if you have input into like an input field, the data model will be updated. So with the UI library, we can actually connect our React elements to our to-do list item data model. So for example, to keep this brief, I have the item card here. I'll hit configure. And then for the name field, I will link it to the to-do model name field. But we can also connect events, so like button clicks. For this close button, I have connected it to delete command for a to-do item based on the ID. And we also have other functionality that we can tap into, like navigation. So for the nav bar, whenever someone clicks the add button, we will redirect to a create route in our app. Really cool. So how would this look like from our front end, right? Let's jump in there. So for example, in our index page, our home page, we will be using the navbar component. So after doing amplify pull command, we have a folder with UI components that are generated based on the Figma designs. So we will be using the navbar component that you saw in the Figma design. We will be using the page content wrapper to set some margins and positioning on the main content. And then finally, we'll be using the item card collection. So I actually forgot to show that off in the UI library. For the item card collection, it's a really cool way to present lists of information. So because we configured the single card to map to a single data item, we can now configure a collection. We can add sort conditions, we can add search functionality, and some minor formatting. So this will create an item card collection React element that we can use in our project. So in our item card collection, I set our placeholder. So this item card collection maps to a Amplify UI frameworks collection element. And here we are setting a no results found element, as well as we're setting some configurations for the to-do items, like updating our data on click. So next up. Right. Another cool thing that developers spend a lot of time doing is writing form validation. It is fun for the first 50 times, but then the other 50 times are not as much fun. So if only there was a way to build your forms given a kind of the definition of your model. But here we have a solution for that really common problem. We can jump back to our UI library here. And we have two forms configured automatically for our to-do list item. Because typically you want to create and update an item, we'll have two forms generated here for creation and updating an item. We have a checkmark field, which I actually removed setting up for this presentation, but you'd have all the default fields configurable. And you can add your custom validation rules to each field if you need to add various business logic here. So great way to save time building forms, because now all we need to do is just use that form element. So we have a create root here, a create page, again, protected page wrapped in our authenticator component. We have our detail navbar, and inside our page content, we just have a create form with some minor configuration. Yeah, so simple to get that functionality. What does that look like? So let's jump into our app here really quick. Oop, already have an account. Oops, 1 second. So I already have an account that I've been testing with. And here I already have a bunch of items added previously. So you can recognize each of the Figma designs in here. And let's jump to the create item root to see what the create form looks like. Nothing fancy, but hey, we have a create form that's connected to our database where you can create a new item really quickly. Yep. So next up. So we've covered the integration of our project, add the components to the pages, add forms, and then finally working with the data store. So for this app, I'm using the data store, Amplify's data store library. Data store is a library that implements a repository pattern where you have a single object that you can make, you can fetch it and then you can make changes to, and then that will be automatically persisted to the backend behind the scenes, and you don't really have to worry about any kind of complicated things, so like syncing and all that. And if you have two apps running side by side, if you modify the same object, you'll see the changes in the other instance. So it's really great for collaboration. Yeah, just really awesome. So here, I'm using data store to update our to-do item. So I get a Boolean flag from our checkbox or a toggle box, and then I use that value to update our initial item. That's a to-do model, and then I pass it the new value, and then that updates the model asynchronously, and our list will automatically be updated. So a lot of complicated things happening behind the scenes, but if you want more customization, if you want to do server-side rendering, you can also use the GraphQL API, but for time constraints here, I will not be showing off your typical GraphQL API calls. So next up, but wait, there's one more thing. What do most apps also use? File uploads. So we'll quickly add the file upload element to our app here in just a few steps. First, we will we'll run Amplify add storage, same way we added API in the beginning. We will add a file uploader component from the UI library, and we'll just add it to our update screen, and we'll update the model. So there is a little bit more code for the updating the UI, but it's still relatively simple. So for our update root here, we also have it password protected. We have our nav bar, we have our page content, our form, but then below the form we'll have a update layout here. In the update layout, the main thing that we're using is the file uploader element, which we configure with maximum file size, file types, and on success listener. And on success, we just update our to-do, like we did for the check field. And it looks, again, with very few lines of code, we have an image uploader for set up for our items. So for clicking into one of the items, we'll see the item details. We can modify it with the form. But we also have a file uploader element here, done with very minimal, work. So here we can upload an image, and it will be rendered once it's uploaded. That's the file uploads. And yeah, the conclusion. So here, as you saw, we were able to build a full stack application that had authentication, that had data sync, that had file uploads in a very short amount of time. So altogether, this took me probably 4 hours to implement. Probably could have been a little bit faster if I didn't spend also time writing the slides. So yeah, the source code is available at this QR code. That's my repository, and please follow me on Twitter for more educational content and all things web dev and some mobile development as well. Yeah, now I'll open up for questions. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, just one small question. I'm just interested in, is there other cloud providers like Google Cloud or the Microsoft Azure have this kind of sets of services in order to speed up the development?
Yes. So Azure has a bundle, but I'm more familiar with the Google Firebase, right? So Firebase allows for easy configuration of your database, your authentication as well. They're very similar they were very similar in their offering maybe a year ago, but in the last year, I saw Amplify add a lot of features like the entire UI framework that I was just showing, like generating the form for your data models. So I would say Amplify is a little bit ahead of Google Firebase, but again, I haven't looked at Firebase in probably about a year. So they will have a similar set of.
Yeah, because I've heard a lot that mobile developers especially, they prefer to use Firebase in order to speed up some part of the development. That's why I was asking. And for me, I'm curious why the Microsoft not doing something like that as well in Azure.
That's a good question.
Because I think it makes sense to me. Like the Amplify thing really simplifies everything.
Yeah, if you ever wanted to like integrate AWS, any of their services into your app, it can definitely be overwhelming because the configuration is challenging. They have different ways of deploying, right? You have the cloud development kit, you have the older YAML-based configuration deployment, you have a serverless framework that's called serverless. So there's different ways. And I think AWS just has so many services that they had to find a way to bundle it in a nice, digestible way for your average developer to get started quickly. Because then, once they get that deployment, the first deployment done, they can configure their Lambdas, they can configure their like any other parts of their infrastructure after that, right? So you can add your messaging queues, you can add email notifications. So for when users sign up, you can also have push. So this bundles all of the AWS services into kind of easy to get started package.
I think one thing you'll realize about Azure in general is that their offerings are more geared towards the enterprise because independent and smaller organizations don't really favor them. Their technology stack, C++ and all the dated stuff is all more on the enterprise side. So it's more about playing to their market or to their clients. AWS, since it was the leader in the cloud field, they have a lot of, they have actual departments just helping startups. So because they have clients, that's why they're going there. So it's all about once Microsoft has enough clients that require this, they'll also do it. That's the
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So basically the market size, right? So Microsoft might have less clients, but all of them are enterprise, right? But AWS has just so many different clients, right? From indie developers to large companies. So it's, I guess, economical for them to spin up this kind of a.
And yeah, just one last question. And what about the like expenses? How expensive is that, or
Yeah.
it's just a part of the package that you can bought like for hosting your virtual?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is expenses, and basically it's the same billing as for all the AWS services that you're using. So same billing for your Lambda calls, your API gateway. Yeah, so it's when you're deploying a project with Amplify, you're deploying a set of AWS services. So S3 buckets, Lambdas. So it's same usage as for those resources would normally cost you.
Thanks.
I have a question. I think the slides that you've shared, they're geared more towards just the React as a UI. But in terms of the native aspect, right, I don't think we've touched that. So does Amplify give options to, let's say, have CI/CD of packaging it, making binaries, pushing it to the appropriate store, running all the checks that you have to run, which each store has like, hey, you should do this kind of a margin, security checks, all of that. Does it have that as well?
Yeah, so the question is about Amplify. How much does it help with native development, right? App development.
Right.
So for app development, I recently used it for a React Native app. So I pretty much deployed the whole backend with Amplify and right. For the front end, I just used the authentication component to help with the login and registration UI. For the deployment, they don't really help you with deployment of the app because that's really, I guess, not their kind of game or their expertise. But for deployment, I think Expo is great if you're going with the React Native app. Expo is great, App Center, right? So there's great tools for deployment, but for native apps, Amplify won't help you deploy them.
For example, if you compare it to the Ionic side, which isn't React Native, the Ionic guys have started doing this. They know this is a problem, having to run all the checks that different stores require, so they would push it out to the stores and they'll actually charge you for that. But then that's another hassle that they remove from you. You don't have to worry about when do I schedule it, how often do I do it, have I met all the checks in there.
Yeah, and there's exactly right. There's already a lot of services that help you with app deployment to the App Store. Yeah. Any more questions? Right. It's like that's it.